My name is Robert L. Price. I've been a docent and a little bit of everything, and volunteer here at the museum for 20 years, 21 years now, I think it was. And before that, I worked for the Department of Army, and before that, I was worked for air traffic control. To start out with, in the 50s, the Coast Guard organized what they called the Flying Flotillas, Coast Guard Auxiliary. It's kind of like the CAP. At that time, the Coast Guard was responsible for all air search and rescue in the 13th District, and then later they signed an agreement with 4th Air Force, where the Air Force was responsible for overland searches, and the Coast Guard had water searches. But we used to visit the Coast Guard Air Station at Port Angeles, and one day one of the guys was telling us about one of their B-17 pilots had taken the B-17 over to Sandpoint and was going to shoot a touch and go. At least he figures that's what he was going to do. And the controller advised him that he was too high and too hot, too fast. And he told him, "Son, I've been flying airplanes before you were born. Don't tell me how to fly this airplane." So I went ahead and landed. And when he got through with his rollout, you could see the top 7 feet of the vertical fin in the lake. So, needless to say, fortunately his dad was an admiral, so he just got transferred instead of drummed out. The other experience with the Sandpoint is when I worked air traffic, we used to work S2F trackers. They were little twin-engine aircraft that used to fly all over the place. On weekends, the Naval Reserve pilots would fly them, and they'd go to San Diego. Apparently, a party town anyway. But they would file out of Sandpoint 20 minutes apart, same altitude and same airspeed, that's legal because you only had to have 10 minutes separation. But the problem was they checked Seattle 18 minutes apart, Portland 12 minutes apart, and Eugene together. So we had to separate them. We had another one, a naval pilot was going down, and he was flying VFR on top. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but after the accident with the 2 United airplanes in the Grand Canyon, they came up with, before that, when you got on top of the overcast, you could cancel your IFR, but then they came up with what they call VFR on top. All you had to do was you maintain a VFR altitude and make position reports. So he's VFR on top going to San Diego, and he's at the wrong altitude. So the controller kept saying, "Say again your altitude," because you can't call him a liar, you know. And he'd just come right back with the same altitude. So finally the controller got upset, and he said, "Be advised, for your direction of flight you should be at," and gave him the altitude. He said, "Center, when did they change that? I haven't flown this route in 3 months." He pulled the book down, looked it up, and it's 3 years since they changed it. So that's one of the things. But that's about all I can tell you about Sandpoint. Other than the fact we had a helicopter unit over there at one time. I worked for the Department of Army. We had a Chinook unit and a Medivac, Aerovac, Huey outfit operated out there for a while. Then they finally moved to Payne Field, and then they went to Fort Lewis. I was a Department of Army civilian. I wore 2 hats. I was a reservist on weekends and civilian during the week. I was stationed at Fort Lawton. Now, I didn't have anything to do with flying in the military. Just air traffic control afterwards. I have a private pilot's license, and I learned to fly in 1953, got my license then. Met a lot of interesting people over the years and had a good time doing it. I learned to fly in Oregon, and my flight instructor was an old-time pilot, and so I shirt-tailed on him because he knew everybody in 3 states, I think. Plus the fact that the State Board of Aeronautics was pretty buddy-buddy, so I'd shirt-tail on them every time I got a chance. Being a young private pilot, I learned a lot of experience and so that way. And we happened to go to Portland to the Chamber of Commerce fly-in, and Chuck Yeager and Everest and Pancho Barnes and all those people were there as guests. And I didn't pay any attention to anybody but Yeager and Everest because they're the only names I recognized, and everybody that was there was famous. So, but it's a very interesting life. I enjoyed it, and I had a lot of fun flying.